The autumn rain fell in relentless sheets upon the glass roof of Ashworth's tea pavilion, each drop a whisper of scandal that would soon become a roar. Inside, beneath the ornate iron framework and climbing roses, Lady Eloise Hartley sat perfectly still, her gloved hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the untouched teacup before her. She had been waiting for 3 hours. The other patrons had long since departed, their curious glances and hushed whispers trailing behind them like the scent of bergamot and betrayal. The proprietress approached with pitying eyes, but Eloise raised one hand, silent, dignified, refusing charity. She would wait. He had promised to come, but when the clock struck 5 and the ornate doors of the pavilion swung open, it was not her betrothed who entered. It was the Duke of Ravenswood himself, flanked by a small boy with eyes too old for his years, and in the Duke's hand was a document that would shatter everything Eloise thought she knew about her future. If you're listening to this story, don't forget to click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments from which part of the world you're listening to this story. I want to know how far it has traveled. Lady Eloise Hartley had been raised to be perfect. From the moment she drew her first breath in the grand estate of Hartley Manor in the heart of Gloucestershire, her life had been a carefully orchestrated symphony of expectations. The year was 1883, and the Hartley family, though not titled, possessed something far more valuable in the eyes of English society: old money, impeccable breeding, and connections that stretched like golden threads through the highest echelons of the aristocracy. Eloise's childhood had been one of privilege, wrapped in silk ribbons and tied with the strings of duty. Her mother, the formidable Constance Hartley, had supervised every aspect of her education with the precision of a general planning a military campaign. French, Italian, and German were spoken fluently. The pianoforte was mastered to concert standard. Watercolors, embroidery, the management of a great household, all these skills were cultivated with relentless dedication. But it was Eloise's particular gift that set her apart. She possessed a voice of such crystalline beauty that even the most jaded members of society would fall silent when she sang. Yet for all her accomplishments, Eloise had learned early that her voice was not truly her own. It was an asset, like the family's silver or the ancestral portraits that lined the gallery walls. And like all assets, it was to be invested wisely. The investment had been arranged when Eloise was barely 17. Lord Percival Ashworth, heir to the Ashworth shipping fortune and nephew to the Earl of Westmarch, had been deemed the perfect match. The Ashworths were nouveau riche, their wealth built on trade rather than land, but their fortune was vast and their social ambitions insatiable. An alliance with the Hartleys would provide them with the respectability they craved, while the Hartley coffers, somewhat depleted by her father's unfortunate investments in failing railway ventures, would be handsomely replenished. Eloise had met Percival exactly 4 times before their engagement was announced. He was handsome in a conventional way, with fair hair carefully pomaded, a well-trimmed moustache, and the confident bearing of a man who had never been denied anything he desired. During their chaperoned meetings, he had been courteous, even charming, speaking of his travels to the continent, his memberships in the most exclusive London clubs, and his expectations for their future together. "You shall want for nothing, Miss Hartley," he had assured her during their 3rd meeting, his pale blue eyes assessing her as one might evaluate a thoroughbred mare. "The Ashworth townhouse in Belgravia is being refurbished to the latest fashion. You will have your own carriage, your own staff, and naturally you will be presented at court. My mother has already secured the necessary introductions." Eloise had smiled and nodded as she had been taught. She had not mentioned the small hope that flickered in her heart, that perhaps, in time, affection might grow between them, that perhaps marriage might offer not just security, but companionship. Even she dared to dream in her most private moments, love. The engagement had been celebrated with a grand ball at Hartley Manor. 300 guests had attended, including several members of the peerage. Eloise had worn a gown of ivory silk and Brussels lace, her dark chestnut hair arranged in an elaborate coiffure adorned with pearls. She had danced the first waltz with Percival, his hand firm at her waist, his breath smelling faintly of brandy and tobacco. "You look exquisite tonight," he had murmured, though his eyes had wandered more than once to her younger sister Cecilia, who was laughing too loudly with a group of young officers near the terrace doors. The months that followed had been consumed with wedding preparations. The ceremony was to take place at St. George's, Hanover Square, followed by a wedding breakfast at the Ashworth residence. The guest list had swelled to over 400. Eloise's trousseau had been assembled with painstaking care. Morning dresses, afternoon gowns, evening ensembles, travelling costumes, all from the finest modistas in London. Her mother had supervised every detail, her satisfaction evident in the set of her shoulders and the rare softness in her voice when she spoke to her eldest daughter. "You have done well, Eloise," Constance had said one afternoon as they reviewed the final seating arrangements. "This marriage will secure not only your future, but that of your sisters as well. Cecilia and Arabella will benefit enormously from your connection to the Ashworths." Eloise had felt the weight of that responsibility settle more heavily upon her shoulders. It was not just her own happiness at stake, but the welfare of her entire family. Yet, as the wedding day approached, subtle changes had begun to trouble her. Percival's visits to Hartley Manor had become less frequent. When he did call, he seemed distracted, his attention wandering, his conversation perfunctory. Twice he had cancelled planned outings at the last moment, sending notes of apology that cited pressing business matters. Her letters to him, carefully composed and filled with gentle inquiries about his welfare, received only brief formal replies. "He is simply occupied with his affairs," her mother had assured her when Eloise had tentatively expressed her concerns. "Men of business have many demands upon their time. Once you are married, you will have his full attention." Eloise had wanted to believe this. She had tried to ignore the whispers she sometimes overheard among the servants, the way conversations would stop abruptly when she entered a room, the pitying glances from her younger sisters. The final week before the wedding had been a whirlwind of final fittings, last-minute adjustments, and the arrival of out-of-town guests. The Ashworth family had taken up residence at Claridge's Hotel, and a series of pre-wedding events had been scheduled. It was at one of these, a garden party at the Ashworth estate in Richmond, that Eloise had first noticed the particular attention Percival paid to Miss Charlotte Pemberton. Charlotte was the daughter of a wealthy industrialist, beautiful in a bold, modern way that seemed to captivate every man in her vicinity. She wore her golden hair in the latest style. Her gowns were cut just slightly more daringly than propriety strictly allowed, and she possessed a laugh that carried across lawns and drawing rooms like a bell. Eloise had watched as Percival bent close to whisper something in Charlotte's ear, had seen the flush that rose in the other woman's cheeks, the way her hand had lingered on his arm just a moment too long. When Eloise had approached them, Charlotte had smiled with perfect politeness, but her green eyes had held a glitter of triumph that made Eloise's stomach tighten with unnamed dread. "Miss Hartley," Charlotte had said, her voice honey-sweet. "How lovely you look. That shade of lavender is so sensible." The word had stung more than any overt insult could have done. That evening, Eloise had tried to speak with Percival privately, but he had been evasive, claiming fatigue and an early morning appointment. He had kissed her hand with mechanical courtesy and departed, leaving her standing alone in the Ashworth's grand foyer, surrounded by gilt mirrors that reflected her uncertainty back at her from every angle. The night before the wedding, Eloise had barely slept. She had lain awake in her childhood bedroom, listening to the sounds of the house settling around her, trying to quiet the anxiety that fluttered in her chest like a caged bird. Tomorrow, she told herself, all would be well. Tomorrow, she would become Lady Percival Ashworth, and this strange, unsettled feeling would dissipate like morning mist. But morning had brought not reassurance, but a note delivered by a stone-faced footman. The message was brief, written in Percival's bold hand. "Meet me at Ashworth's tea pavilion at 2 o'clock. We must speak privately before the ceremony. Come alone. P." The tea pavilion was a fashionable establishment in Mayfair, known for its discretion and its elegant glass-roofed conservatory, where society's elite conducted their most delicate conversations. Eloise had dressed carefully in a walking costume of deep blue wool, her heart hammering with a mixture of hope and apprehension. Perhaps Percival had sensed her doubts. Perhaps he wished to offer her reassurance, to speak words of affection that had been impossible in the constant presence of chaperones and family. She had arrived precisely at 2 o'clock, her maid dismissed to wait in the carriage. The pavilion had been moderately busy, filled with the gentle clink of china and the murmur of refined conversation. Eloise had taken a table near the windows, ordered tea, and waited. As the clock hands moved inexorably forward and Percival did not appear, Eloise had felt the first cold finger of dread trace down her spine. Around her, other patrons began to take notice. Whispers started, barely audible at first, then growing in volume and boldness. By 4 o'clock, the truth was inescapable. She had been stood up, abandoned, made a spectacle before all of fashionable London. The rain that had threatened all afternoon finally broke at 4:30, drumming against the glass roof of the tea pavilion with a violence that matched the storm gathering in Eloise's chest. She sat motionless, her spine straight, her hands folded in her lap with the discipline of years of deportment lessons. The teacup before her had long since grown cold, a thin film forming on the surface of the untouched Earl Grey. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. Not here. Not now. But the whispers had grown impossible to ignore. They rustled through the pavilion like wind through dead leaves, each syllable a small cut that bled her dignity away drop by drop. Poor thing. Been sitting there for hours. "I heard the wedding is supposed to be tomorrow. Can you imagine? They say Lord Ashworth has been seen with the Pemberton girl. Quite openly, actually. Someone should tell her. This is simply cruel." The proprietress, Mrs. Dalrymple, a kind-faced woman who had known Eloise since childhood, approached with evident distress. "Lady Eloise," she said softly, using the courtesy title that would officially become hers tomorrow, if there was still to be a tomorrow. "Perhaps I might send word to your family. Surely there has been some mistake, some misunderstanding." "Thank you, Mrs. Dalrymple," Eloise replied, her voice steady despite the chaos churning within her. "But I shall wait a little longer. Lord Ashworth must have been detained by some urgent matter." Even as she spoke the words, she knew them for the lie they were. No urgent matter would keep a man from his bride the day before their wedding. No business could be so pressing that it would warrant this public abandonment. Something was terribly, irrevocably wrong. The clock struck 5. Its chimes echoing through the now quiet pavilion. Most of the other patrons had departed, driven away by the storm or by the uncomfortable spectacle of Eloise's vigil. Those who remained made little pretense of not staring, their faces reflecting varying degrees of pity, curiosity, and barely concealed schadenfreude. It was precisely as the final chime faded that the doors of the pavilion burst open with a force that sent them crashing against the walls. Rain swept in on a gust of wind, and with it came 3 figures that would alter the course of Eloise's life forever. The first was a man of perhaps 40 years, tall and commanding, with dark hair silvered at the temples and eyes the color of winter storms. He wore a greatcoat of finest wool, rain-darkened at the shoulders, and carried himself with the unmistakable authority of one accustomed to absolute obedience. This was Alexander Blackwood, the Duke of Ravenswood, one of the wealthiest and most powerful peers in England. His estates stretched across 3 counties, his influence reached into Parliament and the highest circles of government, and his reputation was that of a man both brilliant and utterly uncompromising. Beside him stood a boy of perhaps 8 or 9 years, small for his age, with the same dark hair and storm-grey eyes as the Duke. This was Lord Thomas Blackwood, the Duke's heir and only child. The boy's face was solemn, almost grave, and he regarded the scene before him with an intensity that seemed far too mature for his years. The third figure was a solicitor. Evident from the leather document case, he clutched protectively against the rain and the nervous energy that radiated from him as he hurried to keep pace with the Duke's long strides. Every eye in the pavilion turned toward this unexpected arrival. The Duke of Ravenswood was not a man who frequented tea-rooms, nor was he known for social calls. His appearances in London society were rare and always significant. His presence here now was nothing short of extraordinary. The Duke's gaze swept the room with the precision of a hawk surveying a field, and then fixed upon Eloise with an intensity that made her breath catch. He crossed the distance between them in a few long strides, his boots striking the floor with decisive purpose. The young Lord Thomas followed close behind, his small hand gripping a corner of his father's coat. "Lady Eloise Hartley," the Duke said, his voice carrying clearly through the sudden silence. It was not a question, but a statement, delivered with absolute certainty. Eloise rose slowly, her training overriding her shock. She curtsied with perfect form, though her mind raced with confusion. "Your Grace," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. I am honored, though I confess myself surprised by your presence." The Duke's expression was unreadable, carved from granite and shadow. "Surprised, perhaps, but not as surprised as you are about to be." He gestured to the solicitor, who stepped forward and opened his document case with trembling fingers. "Mr. Pemberton, if you would be so kind." The solicitor, Pemberton, the same surname as Charlotte, extracted a sheaf of papers and handed them to the Duke with evident reluctance. The Duke, in turn, held them out to Eloise. "I believe you should see these before you hear the news from any other source," he said, his tone gentler now, though no less commanding. "What I am about to tell you will be painful, but I have found that swift truth, however cutting, is preferable to slow poison." Eloise's hands shook as she took the documents. The first was a marriage license, dated that very day, bearing the names of Percival Ashworth and Charlotte Pemberton. The second was a letter in Percival's hand, addressed to his solicitor, formally breaking his engagement to Eloise and citing irreconcilable differences in temperament and expectation. The third was a notice prepared for the Times, announcing his marriage to Miss Pemberton and expressing regret for any inconvenience caused to Miss Hartley and her family. The words swam before Eloise's eyes. Married. He had married Charlotte Pemberton. Today, while Eloise sat here waiting for him like a fool, while all of London prepared for a wedding that would never take place, while her family, her reputation, her entire future hung in the balance. They were married by special license at St. Saviour's in Suffolk 3 hours ago, the Duke continued, his voice cutting through the roaring in Eloise's ears. The ceremony was witnessed by Miss Pemberton's father and Lord Ashworth's cousin. They are at this moment en route to Dover, from whence they will depart for the continent. I'm informed they plan to remain abroad for at least 6 months, until the scandal has subsided. Eloise could not speak, could not breathe. The papers slipped from her nerveless fingers and scattered across the floor. Around her she was dimly aware of gasps, of excited whispers erupting like wildfire. This was not merely scandal, this was social annihilation. "How?" she managed to whisper. "How did you know?" The Duke's expression hardened. "Because Mr. Pemberton here is my wife's cousin, and he had the decency, or perhaps the fear, to inform me of what his niece and Lord Ashworth had planned. He came to me this morning, hoping I might intervene, might prevent this disaster. I was too late to stop the marriage, but I was not too late to ensure you did not learn of it from tomorrow's newspapers, or worse, from the assembled guests at a church where no groom would appear." The young Lord Thomas stepped forward then, his small face creased with concern. "Father said you were being treated very badly," he said in a clear, high voice. "He said that Lord Ashworth is a coward and a scoundrel, and that you deserve to know the truth with dignity." Despite everything, the shock, the humiliation, the complete destruction of her future, Eloise felt something crack inside her at the child's earnest words. A sound escaped her throat, half laugh, half sob, and she pressed her gloved hand to her mouth to stifle it. The Duke's hand came to rest on his son's shoulder. Thomas speaks plainly as children do, but he is not wrong. What has been done to you, Lady Eloise, is unconscionable. Lord Ashworth has acted without honour, without decency, and without any regard for the consequences of his actions upon you and your family. My family? Eloise breathed, the full horror of the situation crashing over her like a wave. Oh God, my family, the guests, the church, the breakfast. Everything is prepared. Everyone will know. We will be ruined, utterly ruined. She swayed on her feet, and the Duke moved with surprising speed, his hand gripping her elbow to steady her. His touch was firm, but not indelicate, and through the layers of shock, Eloise registered the strength in those fingers, the warmth that penetrated even through her gloves and sleeve. "Sit," he commanded, guiding her back into her chair. He gestured sharply to Mrs. Dalrymple, who had been hovering nearby with a face pale as milk. "Brandy, quickly." Within moments, a glass was pressed into Eloise's hands. She drank without thinking, the liquid burning down her throat and bringing tears to her eyes. The Duke waited until she had drained half the glass before he spoke again. "You will not be ruined," he said with absolute conviction. "Not if you are willing to accept an alternative that I am prepared to offer." Eloise looked up at him through blurred vision, unable to comprehend his meaning. "Your Grace, I do not understand." The Duke exchanged a glance with his son, and something passed between them. Some silent communication that spoke of previous discussion, of plans already laid. Then he turned back to Eloise, and his storm-grey eyes held hers with an intensity that made the rest of the world fade away. "I am offering you a choice, Lady Eloise, a way forward that will preserve your reputation, protect your family, and ensure that you are not left to face the consequences of another man's dishonour alone." He paused, and in that pause the entire pavilion seemed to hold its breath. "I am offering you marriage. To me." The world tilted on its axis. Eloise stared at the Duke of Ravenswood, certain she had misheard, certain that shock had finally fractured her ability to comprehend reality. Marriage. To the Duke, it was impossible, absurd, and yet he stood before her, his expression grave and entirely serious, waiting for her response. "Your Grace," she managed, her voice barely audible even to her own ears. Surely you cannot mean—" "I mean precisely what I said." The Duke's tone was matter-of-fact, as though he were discussing a business arrangement rather than a proposal of marriage. "The situation is dire, Lady Eloise, and it requires a solution that is both swift and decisive. Your reputation hangs by a thread. By tomorrow morning, all of London will know that you were jilted on the eve of your wedding. The scandal will be catastrophic, not only for you, but for your entire family. Your younger sisters will find their prospects destroyed by association. Your parents will be ostracized. The Hartley name, which has stood unblemished for generations, will become synonymous with humiliation and failure." Each word was a hammer blow, driving home the terrible truth of her situation. Eloise felt the brandy roiling in her stomach, threatening to rise. "However," the Duke continued, "if it were to be announced that you had in fact called off your engagement to Lord Ashworth because you had received a far more advantageous offer, an offer from a duke no less, the narrative changes entirely. You become not a victim, but a woman of remarkable fortune and discernment. Lord Ashworth becomes the fool who lost a prize beyond his deserving, and your family's position is not merely preserved, but elevated." But why?" Eloise whispered. "Why would you do this? You do not know me. We have never even been introduced. What possible reason could you have for making such an offer?" For the first time, something flickered in the Duke's eyes, something that might have been pain, or perhaps memory. He glanced down at his son, who was watching the exchange with those unnervingly mature eyes, and then back to Eloise. "I have my reasons," he said quietly. "Reasons that are my own. But know this, I'm not acting out of pity, nor am I seeking a love match. My wife died 3 years ago, and I have no intention of replacing her in my heart. What I require is a duchess, someone to manage my households, to serve as hostess for necessary social functions, and to provide companionship and guidance for my son. In return, you will have my name, my protection, and my complete support. You will want for nothing material, and you will be treated with the respect and dignity that your position demands." It was, Eloise realized with a strange clarity, the most honest proposal she had ever heard. There were no false declarations of affection, no pretty lies about love growing in time, just a straightforward exchange, her social skills and presence for his protection and status. Young Thomas stepped forward again, his small hand reaching out to touch Eloise's where it rested on the table. "I think you would be a good mama," he said simply. "Father has been very sad since Mama died, and I am lonely in that big house. It would be nice to have someone kind living with us." The child's words, so artless and sincere, pierced through Eloise's shock in a way that all the Duke's logical arguments had not. She looked down at the small hand covering hers, at the hope shining in those grey eyes, and felt something shift in her chest. "Thomas," the Duke said gently, "that is not—" "It is all right," Eloise interrupted, surprising herself. She turned her hand over and squeezed the boy's fingers gently. "Thank you, Lord Thomas. That is perhaps the kindest thing anyone has said to me today." She looked up at the Duke, studying him properly for the first time. He was handsome, she supposed, in a severe, austere way. His face was all sharp angles and strong lines, the face of a man who had known power and responsibility from birth. There was no softness in him, no easy charm like Percival's. But there was something else, a fundamental solidity, a sense that here was a man who said what he meant and meant what he said. "If I were to accept," she said slowly, testing the words, "what would be expected of me, beyond the duties you have mentioned? You would live primarily at Ravenswood Hall in Derbyshire, though we maintain a townhouse in London for the season. You would have complete authority over the household management and the supervision of Thomas's education. You would accompany me to necessary social functions and serve as my hostess. In private, I would expect courtesy and mutual respect, but I would not intrude upon your personal time or space. We would maintain separate bedchambers, and I would make no marital demands upon you." The delicacy with which he phrased this last part would have been almost amusing under other circumstances. Eloise felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she forced herself to meet his gaze steadily. "And if I refuse? If I choose to face the scandal alone? Then I will respect your decision and trouble you no further. But I would urge you to consider carefully, Lady Eloise. Pride is a luxury that few can afford when their entire future is at stake." It was this, the acknowledgement that the choice was truly hers, that he would not force or coerce her, that decided the matter. Eloise looked around the tea pavilion, at the faces still watching avidly, at Mrs. Dalrymple wringing her hands by the counter, at the rain still streaming down the glass walls. She thought of her mother's face when she learned the truth, of her father's quiet devastation, of her sister's ruined prospects. She thought of the long, bitter years ahead, as a jilted spinster forever marked by Percival's betrayal. And then she looked at the Duke and his son, at the strange, unexpected lifeline they were offering her. "Very well," she heard herself say, her voice stronger now. "I accept your proposal, Your Grace." The Duke's expression did not change, but she saw his shoulders relax fractionally, as though he had been holding tension she had not noticed. "Then we must act quickly. Mr. Pemberton, the special license?" The solicitor produced another document from his case, a special license for marriage between Alexander Blackwood, Duke of Ravenswood, and Eloise Hartley, spinster. It was already prepared, already signed by the Archbishop of Canterbury. "You were very certain of my answer," Eloise observed, a hint of something that might have been humor creeping into her voice despite everything. "I was hopeful," the Duke corrected. "There is a difference. We will be married tonight quietly at the chapel at Ravenswood House. Tomorrow morning I will send announcements to all the major newspapers. By the time London awakens, you will be the Duchess of Ravenswood, and Lord Ashworth's betrayal will be reduced to a footnote in a far more interesting story." He offered her his arm, and after a moment's hesitation, Eloise took it. As they moved toward the door, she caught sight of their reflection in one of the pavilion's many mirrors, the tall, dark Duke, the small, solemn boy, and herself, pale and shocked, but somehow still standing. "Your Grace," she said quietly, as they stepped out into the rain, where a magnificent carriage bearing the Ravenswood crest waited. "Why did you really do this? The truth, if you please." The Duke handed Thomas into the carriage first, then turned to face her. Rain ran down his face, plastering his dark hair to his forehead, and for a moment the severe lines of his face softened into something almost human. "Because 3 years ago, I watched my wife die slowly and painfully, and I could do nothing to save her. Because I have spent every day since then feeling powerless in the face of fate and circumstance. And because when Mr. Pemberton told me what was being done to you, I realized that here, finally, was something I could fix, someone I could save. Perhaps that makes me selfish. Perhaps it makes me a fool. But I have wealth and power enough to indulge in both selfishness and foolishness, and I choose to use them for this." He handed her into the carriage, and as she settled onto the plush velvet seat beside Thomas, Eloise realized that she was crying, not from despair, but from a strange, overwhelming sense of relief. The boy immediately produced a clean handkerchief and offered it to her with grave courtesy. "Thank you," she whispered, pressing it to her eyes. The Duke climbed in and rapped on the ceiling, and the carriage lurched into motion. Through the rain-streaked windows, Eloise watched the tea pavilion recede into the distance, and with it, the life she had thought she would live. Ahead lay only uncertainty, a marriage to a stranger, and a future she could not begin to imagine. But as the carriage rolled through the London streets toward Ravenswood House, and as young Thomas's small hand crept into hers once more, Eloise felt something she had not felt in months: hope. The chapel at Ravenswood House was small and private, lit by candles that cast dancing shadows on the ancient stone walls. The ceremony was brief, witnessed only by Mr. Pemberton and the Duke's elderly housekeeper, Mrs. Thornbury, who wept openly throughout. Eloise spoke her vows in a voice that barely trembled, and when the Duke slid a heavy gold ring onto her finger, a ring that had belonged to his grandmother, he told her quietly, she felt the weight of it like a brand, marking her irrevocably as his. "I will do my best to be worthy of this," she whispered, as the vicar pronounced them man and wife. "You already are," the Duke replied, and though his voice was formal, his eyes held a warmth that had not been there before. That night, Eloise slept in a bedchamber more luxurious than any she had ever known, in a bed hung with silk curtains and piled with down pillows. She should have been awake, tormented by the day's events, by the strangeness of her new situation. But instead, she fell into a deep, dreamless sleep, and when she woke in the morning to find a maid drawing back the curtains and addressing her as "Your Grace," it felt not like a nightmare, but like the first day of a life she had never dared to imagine. The announcement appeared in the Times, the Morning Post, and every other newspaper of consequence on the morning after Eloise's wedding. It was brief, elegant, and utterly devastating to those who had anticipated a very different scandal. The Duke of Ravenswood is pleased to announce his marriage to Lady Eloise Hartley, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Charles Hartley of Hartley Manor, Gloucestershire. The ceremony took place privately at Ravenswood House. The Duke and Duchess will reside at Ravenswood Hall and will not be receiving visitors for the immediate future. London society erupted. In drawing rooms across Mayfair and Belgravia, over breakfast tables laden with silver and fine china, the news was dissected with the fervour usually reserved for matters of state. Lady Eloise Hartley, the same girl who had been engaged to Lord Ashworth, had married a duke. Not just any duke, but the Duke of Ravenswood, one of the wealthiest and most reclusive peers in England. The implications were staggering. At Hartley Manor, the announcement was received with emotions that ranged from shock to profound relief. Constance Hartley, who had spent a sleepless night preparing for social ruin, instead found herself the mother of a duchess. Charles Hartley, who had been composing letters of apology to wedding guests, instead found himself writing notes of explanation that barely concealed his triumph. Cecilia and Arabella, who had been weeping over their ruined prospects, instead found themselves suddenly elevated by their sister's extraordinary match. The note that Eloise had sent by special messenger the night before had been brief. "Do not worry. All is well. I am married to the Duke of Ravenswood. I will write more fully soon. Your loving daughter, Eloise." It had been enough to prevent panic, but not enough to satisfy curiosity. Within hours of the announcement, Constance Hartley was in her carriage, bound for London and Ravenswood House, determined to understand how this miraculous reversal had occurred. Meanwhile, at a significantly less grand establishment in Suffolk, Percival Ashworth was reading the same announcement with a face that had gone the colour of old parchment. Charlotte Pemberton, now Charlotte Ashworth, stood beside him, her expression shifting rapidly from confusion to disbelief to fury. "It is not possible," she hissed, snatching the newspaper from his hands. "She was nobody, a country mouse with a pretty voice. How could she have secured a duke?" Percival said nothing. He was calculating with growing horror exactly what he had lost. The Hartley connection, which he had dismissed as merely respectable, had now become a ducal alliance. The girl he had jilted was now one of the most powerful women in England. And he had married the niece of a solicitor, a woman whose father's wealth came from manufacturing, whose social position was tenuous at best. "We must return to London immediately," Charlotte declared, her voice shrill with panic. "We must make our explanations, must ensure that people understand." "Understand what?" Percival interrupted bitterly. "That I broke my engagement to a woman who then immediately married a duke? That I chose you over a future duchess? There is no explanation that will make us appear anything other than fools." The honeymoon trip to the continent was cancelled. They returned to London within the week, to a reception that was decidedly cool. Invitations that had been expected did not arrive. Calls that were made were returned with stiff formality or not at all. The Ashworth name, which had been rising steadily in society's estimation, suddenly found itself tarnished by association with scandal and poor judgment. At Ravenswood Hall, Eloise was learning to navigate her new life with a mixture of trepidation and growing confidence. The hall was magnificent, a sprawling estate of golden stone set in hundreds of acres of parkland, with formal gardens, a lake, and views that stretched to the distant peaks of the Derbyshire hills. The house itself was a masterpiece of Georgian architecture, filled with priceless art, ancient tapestries, and the accumulated treasures of generations of Blackwoods. Mrs. Thornbury, the housekeeper, had taken Eloise under her wing with a devotion that bordered on fierce. "The house has been too quiet since the late Duchess passed," she confided, as she showed Eloise through the endless succession of rooms. "His Grace has been like a ghost, going through the motions of living, but not truly alive. And young Lord Thomas, well, a boy needs a mother's touch, Your Grace. He needs warmth and laughter, and someone to tuck him in at night." Eloise found herself drawn to Thomas with a speed that surprised her. The boy was precocious and serious, but beneath his grave exterior lay a child who desperately needed affection and attention. She began taking breakfast with him in the nursery, reading to him in the evenings, walking with him through the gardens, and teaching him the names of flowers and birds. His initial reserve melted quickly, and within a fortnight he was chattering to her with the unself-conscious enthusiasm of a child who had finally found someone who truly listened. The Duke himself remained more enigmatic. He was unfailingly courteous, treating Eloise with a formal respect that was both comforting and slightly frustrating. They dined together each evening, and he made a point of asking about her day, her impressions of the estate, her needs and preferences. But he maintained a careful distance, never intruding on her private time, never presuming on the intimacy that their marriage legally entitled him to. "You are settling in well," he observed one evening over dinner, his grey eyes studying her across the candle-lit table. "Mrs. Thornbury tells me the staff are quite taken with you." "They have been very kind," Eloise replied, "though I confess I'm still learning my way. The household is so much larger than what I was accustomed to at home. You will master it quickly enough. You have a natural authority that people respond to." He paused, then added, "Thomas speaks of nothing but you. You have made quite an impression on him. He is a remarkable child," Eloise said warmly. "So intelligent and thoughtful. You must be very proud of him." Something flickered in the Duke's expression. Pain, perhaps, or regret. "I am. Though I fear I have not been the father he deserves these past years. I have been absent, even when present." It was the most personal thing he had said to her since their wedding, and Eloise felt a sudden rush of sympathy for this man who carried his grief like a stone in his chest. "Grief takes time, Your Grace," she said gently. "No one can dictate its course or duration." "Alexander," he said abruptly. "When we are private, you should call me Alexander. We are married after all, even if the circumstances are unconventional." "Alexander," Eloise repeated, testing the name on her tongue. "Then you must call me Eloise." He inclined his head in acknowledgement, and for a moment something like a smile touched his stern features. Eloise. It was 6 weeks after the wedding when the inevitable confrontation occurred. The Duke had business in London that could not be postponed, and Eloise, who had been avoiding the capital, finally agreed to accompany him. They would stay at Ravenswood House for a fortnight, and Eloise would make her first official appearances as the Duchess of Ravenswood. The event chosen for her debut was a charity gala at the Royal Opera House, a glittering affair that would be attended by the cream of society. Eloise dressed with meticulous care, wearing a gown of midnight blue silk that had been created by the finest modiste in London. Sapphires, the Ravenswood sapphires, a legendary set that had not been worn since the late Duchess's death, glittered at her throat and ears. Her hair was arranged in an elaborate coiffure that took her maid 2 hours to perfect. When she descended the stairs at Ravenswood House, Alexander was waiting in the hall. He looked up as she approached, and for a long moment he simply stared. Then he stepped forward and offered his arm. "You look magnificent," he said quietly. "Every inch a duchess." "I am terrified," Eloise admitted in a whisper. "You need not be. I will be beside you every moment, and remember, you have done nothing wrong. You are not the one who should feel shame." The opera house was ablaze with light and colour. As the Duke and Duchess of Ravenswood entered the grand foyer, a hush fell over the assembled crowd. Every eye turned toward them, assessing, judging, speculating. Eloise felt her heart hammering against her ribs, but she kept her head high and her expression serene, her hand resting lightly on Alexander's arm. They had barely taken 10 steps when Eloise saw them, Percival and Charlotte, standing near one of the marble columns. Percival looked haggard, his face drawn and pale. Charlotte's expression was a mask of barely controlled fury. For a moment, their eyes met across the crowded space, and Eloise saw in Charlotte's gaze a hatred so pure it was almost palpable. "Steady," Alexander murmured, his hand covering hers where it rested on his arm. "You are a duchess. She is nothing." They moved through the crowd, Alexander introducing Eloise to various dignitaries and society matrons. The reception was overwhelmingly positive. No one, it seemed, was willing to snub the Duchess of Ravenswood, regardless of the circumstances of her marriage. Eloise found herself surrounded by well-wishers, by women eager to secure her friendship, by men who bowed low over her hand and offered elaborate compliments. It was during the interval that Charlotte finally approached. She had clearly been drinking, her cheeks flushed and her movements slightly unsteady. Percival trailed behind her, his expression one of mortified resignation. "Your Grace," Charlotte said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "How lovely to see you, though I must say your rise has been quite meteoric. One might almost call it suspicious." The conversations around them faltered and died. People turned to watch, scenting drama. Eloise felt Alexander stiffen beside her, but she placed a gentle hand on his arm, silently asking him to let her handle this. "Mrs. Ashworth," Eloise replied, her voice cool and perfectly modulated. "How kind of you to seek me out. I trust you are enjoying married life, though I confess I was surprised by the suddenness of your nuptials. One might almost call it hasty." Charlotte's eyes narrowed. "At least I married for love, rather than for a title and a fortune." "Did you?" Eloise asked, her tone genuinely curious. "How fortunate for you." "I married for respect, for partnership, and for the opportunity to make a meaningful contribution to society. I find those to be far more enduring foundations than mere emotion." She turned to Percival, who had been standing silent and miserable throughout this exchange. "Lord Ashworth, I hope you have found the happiness you sought, though I must thank you, truly. Had you not broken our engagement, I would never have discovered what true partnership could be." "Whoa!" Percival opened his mouth, closed it, then opened it again. "Eloise, Your Grace, I never meant—" "Of course you did not," Eloise interrupted gently. "You simply followed your heart, as we all must do. I wish you every happiness." The dismissal was absolute and devastating. Charlotte's face had gone from flushed to mottled with rage, while Percival looked as though he might be sick. Around them, the watching crowd murmured with approval. The Duchess of Ravenswood had handled the situation with grace, dignity, and a subtle cruelty that left no doubt as to who had emerged victorious from this social battlefield. Alexander's hand found hers and squeezed gently. When Eloise glanced up at him, she saw something in his eyes that she had not seen before: admiration, and perhaps the first stirrings of genuine affection. "Well done," he murmured as they moved away, leaving Percival and Charlotte standing alone in a suddenly empty circle. "Very well done indeed." The rest of the evening passed in a blur of triumph. Eloise was surrounded by admirers, her dance card filled within minutes. She waltzed with Alexander and found that he was an excellent dancer, leading her through the steps with effortless grace. When the evening finally ended and they returned to Ravenswood House, Eloise felt exhausted but exhilarated. "Thank you," she said to Alexander as they stood in the entrance hall, "for standing beside me tonight, for giving me the strength to face them." "You needed no strength from me," Alexander replied. "You have more than enough of your own, but I am glad to have been there to witness it." He hesitated, then added, "Eloise, I know our marriage began as a matter of convenience, of mutual benefit, but I find myself hoping that it might become something more. Not love, perhaps. I do not know if I am capable of that anymore, but friendship at least, partnership, a true meeting of minds." Eloise felt warmth bloom in her chest. "I would like that very much," she said softly. "Very much indeed." He raised her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, the first time he had done so since their wedding night. "Then let us begin again, you and I. Not as strangers bound by circumstance, but as allies choosing to build something worthwhile together." "Yes," Eloise whispered. "Let us begin again." The London season that followed Eloise's triumphant debut was unlike anything she had imagined during her sheltered girlhood at Hartley Manor. As the Duchess of Ravenswood, she found herself at the very pinnacle of society, courted by hostesses, consulted on matters of fashion and taste, and wielding an influence that both thrilled and intimidated her. But it was not the social whirl that occupied most of her thoughts. It was the gradual, almost imperceptible deepening of her relationship with Alexander and the growing bond she shared with young Thomas. The boy had taken to calling her Mama without any prompting, and each time he did so, Eloise felt her heart contract with a fierce, protective love. She supervised his lessons, encouraged his interests in natural history and astronomy, and spent hours reading to him from the extensive library at Ravenswood Hall. Under her care, Thomas began to lose some of his premature gravity, to laugh more freely, to behave like the child he was rather than the miniature adult he had been forced to become. Alexander noticed the change in his son, and his gratitude was evident in 1,000 small gestures. He began seeking Eloise's company not out of obligation, but out of genuine desire. They took long walks through the Ravenswood estate, discussing everything from politics to poetry. They rode together in the early mornings, when the mist still clung to the valleys, and the world seemed newly made. They sat together in the library in the evenings, reading in companionable silence or engaging in spirited debates about the issues of the day. "You have a remarkable mind," Alexander told her one evening as they discussed the latest parliamentary reforms. "I find myself valuing your opinions more than those of most of my advisers." "That is either a great compliment to me or a damning indictment of your advisers," Eloise replied with a smile. He laughed, a sound that was becoming more frequent and which Eloise treasured each time she heard it. Perhaps both. It was during this period that Eloise received an unexpected visitor at Ravenswood House. She was in the morning room, reviewing the household accounts, when Mrs. Thornbury announced, with evident disapproval, that Mrs. Percival Ashworth was requesting an audience. Eloise's first instinct was to refuse. She had no desire to see Charlotte, no interest in whatever drama the woman wished to create. But curiosity won out over caution, and she instructed Mrs. Thornbury to show the visitor in. Charlotte entered the room like a ship in distress, her fashionable gown unable to disguise the strain in her face, the shadows beneath her eyes. She had lost weight, Eloise noticed, and there was a brittleness to her that spoke of desperation. "Your Grace," Charlotte said, executing a curtsy that was technically correct, but lacked any genuine respect. "Thank you for seeing me." "Mrs. Ashworth," Eloise replied coolly, "to what do I owe this unexpected visit?" Charlotte's composure cracked slightly. I have come to ask for your help." Of all the things Eloise had expected, this was not among them. "My help? I cannot imagine what assistance I could possibly provide to you." "You could speak to the Duke," Charlotte said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "You could ask him to use his influence on Percival's behalf. Since our marriage, doors that were once open to us have closed, invitations have ceased, business opportunities have evaporated. Percival's uncle, the Earl, has all but disowned him. We are being frozen out of society, and it is destroying us." Eloise studied the woman before her, seeing not the confident beauty who had stolen her fiancé, but a frightened, foolish girl who was finally confronting the consequences of her actions. She felt no satisfaction in Charlotte's distress, but neither did she feel any obligation to alleviate it. "You made your choices, Mrs. Ashworth," Eloise said quietly, "as did Lord Ashworth. You chose passion over prudence, immediate gratification over long-term stability. Those choices have consequences." "But it is not fair," Charlotte cried, her voice rising. "You have everything, a duke, a fortune, a position. You lost nothing by what happened. Why should we be punished when you have suffered no harm?" Eloise felt a flash of anger, hot and sharp. She rose from her chair, and Charlotte instinctively took a step backward. "No harm?" Eloise repeated, her voice low and dangerous. "You think I suffered no harm? I was publicly humiliated, abandoned on the eve of my wedding, made a spectacle before all of society. My family's reputation was placed in jeopardy. My future was destroyed in a single afternoon. That I was fortunate enough to be offered an alternative does not negate the harm that was done to me." "But you married a duke," Charlotte protested weakly. "Yes, I married a widower, still grieving his lost love, a man I had never met, and I did so not knowing whether he would be kind or cruel, generous or miserly, honorable or despicable. I took an enormous risk, Mrs. Ashworth, and I did so because I had no other choice. That the risk has paid off, that I have found respect and even happiness in my marriage, is due to luck and to the Duke's character, not to any merit of yours or Lord Ashworth's." She moved closer, and Charlotte shrank back further. "You want my help? You want me to intercede on your behalf? Then let me tell you what I will do. I will do nothing. I will not speak to my husband about your situation. I will not use my influence to ease your path. You and Lord Ashworth made your bed, as the saying goes, and now you must lie in it. Perhaps in time society will forgive you. Perhaps you will find a way to rebuild what you have destroyed. But that is your task, not mine." Charlotte's face crumpled, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Please," she whispered, "I am with child, Percival's child. I am frightened, and I do not know what to do." For a moment, Eloise felt her resolve waver. A child, an innocent life that would be born into the mess its parents had created. But then she hardened her heart. This was not her responsibility. She had her own family now, Alexander and Thomas, and they were her priority. "Then I suggest you speak to your husband," Eloise said, her voice gentler now but no less firm, "and to your family. They are the ones who should support you, not I. I wish you well, Mrs. Ashworth, truly, but I cannot help you." Charlotte left in tears, and Eloise stood at the window watching her carriage depart, feeling a complex mixture of emotions. She did not regret her refusal. Charlotte had no right to ask for her help, but she felt a pang of sympathy nonetheless. How quickly fortune could turn, how swiftly pride could be humbled. That evening she told Alexander about the visit. They were in his study, a room she had come to love for its warmth and its scent of leather and tobacco. He listened without interruption, his expression thoughtful. "You handled it correctly," he said when she had finished. "You owe them nothing. But I confess, I'm not surprised that Ashworth is facing difficulties. I may have had a word with certain individuals about his character and judgment, nothing overt, you understand. Simply the truth, shared in the appropriate quarters." Eloise looked at him in surprise. "You did that? For me?" "For you," he confirmed, "and for the principle of the thing. A man who would treat his betrothed with such disrespect deserves to face consequences. I have considerable influence, Eloise, and I see no reason not to use it on behalf of those I care about." Those I care about. The words hung in the air between them, weighted with significance. Eloise felt her pulse quicken. "Alexander," she said softly, I care about you too, about you and Thomas. This family we have built together, it has become more precious to me than I ever imagined possible." He rose from his chair and crossed to where she sat, kneeling beside her so that their eyes were level. "When I married you," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I told myself it was a practical arrangement, a solution to a problem. But somewhere along the way it became something more. You have brought light back into this house, Eloise. You have given my son the mother he needed, and you have given me hope. Hope that perhaps I might learn to live again, rather than merely exist." Eloise reached out and cupped his face in her hands, feeling the slight roughness of his jaw, the warmth of his skin. "Then let us live," she whispered, "together, truly together, not as strangers sharing a house, but as husband and wife in every sense." He searched her eyes, looking for certainty, for permission, and then, slowly, reverently, he leaned forward and kissed her. It was gentle at first, tentative, as though he feared she might pull away. But Eloise leaned into the kiss, her hands sliding into his hair, and felt something inside her unfurl like a flower opening to the sun. When they finally drew apart, both were breathing hard, and Alexander's eyes held a warmth that transformed his entire face. "Are you certain?" he asked. "I would not have you feel obligated." "I am certain," Eloise interrupted. "I want this. I want you. I want the life we can build together." That night, for the first time since their wedding, Eloise did not sleep alone in her grand bedchamber. And in the morning, when she woke in Alexander's arms, she felt a contentment so profound it brought tears to her eyes. The weeks that followed were a revelation. Eloise had not known that marriage could be like this, a partnership of equals, a meeting of minds and hearts and bodies. Alexander was an attentive lover, patient and generous, and Eloise discovered depths of passion within herself that she had never suspected. But more than the physical intimacy, it was the emotional connection that transformed her. They talked for hours, sharing their hopes and fears, their dreams and disappointments. They laughed together, argued occasionally, and always treated each other with respect and affection. Thomas, with the uncanny perception of children, noticed the change in his father and in Eloise. "You are both happier now," he observed one morning at breakfast. "Father smiles more. And you sing sometimes, Mama, when you think no one is listening." Eloise felt herself blush, but Alexander simply reached across the table and took her hand. "We are happy, Thomas," he said. "Very happy indeed. And a great deal of that happiness is due to you and to your mother." "Then I'm glad," Thomas said seriously, "because a family should be happy together." "Out of the mouths of babes," Eloise thought, squeezing Alexander's hand in return. It was in the midst of this newfound happiness that Eloise received word from her own family. Her mother and sisters were coming to visit Ravenswood Hall, eager to see her and to witness her new life. Eloise prepared for their arrival with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. So much had changed since she had last seen them. She was no longer the dutiful daughter, molded to meet others' expectations. She was the Duchess of Ravenswood, a woman who had found her own strength and her own voice. When the Hartley carriage arrived, Eloise was waiting on the front steps, Alexander beside her and Thomas holding her hand. As her mother descended, Eloise saw the moment of shock in Constance's eyes. Shock at the grandeur of the estate, at the obvious wealth and power represented by the Duke, and perhaps most of all, at the transformation in Eloise herself. "Mamma," Eloise said, moving forward to embrace her mother, "welcome to Ravenswood Hall." Constance held her daughter at arm's length, studying her face. "You look radiant," she said, and there was wonder in her voice. "Truly radiant. I had hoped you would be content, but I see you are far more than that." "I am happy, Mamma," Eloise said simply, "happier than I ever dreamed possible." And as she led her family into her home, with Alexander's hand warm at the small of her back, and Thomas chattering excitedly about all the things he wanted to show his new aunts and grandmother, Eloise realized that it was true. The disaster that had seemed to destroy her life had instead led her to this moment, to this place, to this family. She'd been abandoned at a tea pavilion, humiliated and heartbroken, but from those ashes she had risen not just to survive, but to thrive. 18 months after her marriage to the Duke of Ravenswood, Eloise stood in the conservatory at Ravenswood Hall, her hands resting on the gentle swell of her belly, and marvelled at the strange and wondrous path her life had taken. Outside, snow fell softly over the Derbyshire landscape, transforming the estate into a scene from a winter fairy tale. Inside, surrounded by exotic plants and the warm, humid air of the glass-enclosed space, she felt cocooned in contentment. "Mama! Mama, come quickly!" Thomas's voice echoed through the conservatory, and moments later the boy himself appeared, his cheeks flushed with excitement. At 10 years old, he had grown taller, his features beginning to show the promise of the handsome man he would become. But his eyes still held that same earnest intensity that had captured Eloise's heart from their first meeting. "What is it, darling?" Eloise asked, smiling at his enthusiasm. "Father says the pond is frozen solid enough for skating. May we go? Please say yes." Before Eloise could respond, Alexander appeared in the doorway, brushing snow from his greatcoat. His eyes found hers immediately, and the warmth in his gaze made her heart skip a beat even now, after all these months together. "I told him we must ask you first," Alexander said, crossing to her side and pressing a kiss to her temple, "though I suspect I know what your answer will be." "Of course you may go," Eloise said, reaching up to brush a snowflake from Alexander's dark hair. "But you must promise to be careful, Thomas, and you must be back before dark." "I promise," Thomas called, already racing toward the door. "I shall fetch my skates." Alexander lingered, his hand coming to rest over Eloise's, where it curved around her belly. "And what of you? Will you not join us? In my condition? I think not. But I shall watch from the terrace, well wrapped in furs, and applaud your prowess on the ice." "You applaud everything I do," Alexander teased, his lips quirking in that half-smile she loved. "That is because you are remarkably accomplished," Eloise replied primly. "It is not my fault if you excel at everything you attempt." He laughed and pulled her close as her expanding waistline would allow. "I did not excel at widowhood," he said quietly. "I was failing miserably at it until you came into my life and reminded me what it meant to truly live." Eloise tilted her face up to his. "Then we have both saved each other," he whispered. "For I was drowning in expectations and duty until you offered me the freedom to choose my own path." They stood together in the warm green sanctuary of the conservatory, surrounded by the scent of earth and growing things, and Eloise felt a peace so profound it was almost painful in its intensity. Later, wrapped in a fur-lined cloak and seated on the terrace with a blanket over her lap and hot chocolate steaming in a cup beside her, Eloise watched her husband and son glide across the frozen pond. Their laughter carried on the crisp winter air, and she found herself smiling so broadly her cheeks ached. Mrs. Thornbury appeared with fresh hot chocolate and a plate of biscuits. "You should come inside, Your Grace," she fussed. "It is too cold for you to be sitting out here in your condition." "I am perfectly comfortable," Eloise assured her, "and I would not miss this for the world." The housekeeper's stern expression softened. "You have made this house a home again, Your Grace. I never thought to see His Grace so happy, nor young Lord Thomas so carefree. It is a blessing, what you have brought to this family." After Mrs. Thornbury had departed, Eloise reflected on those words. A blessing. Yes, that was what this felt like. But it was a blessing born of disaster, a joy that had emerged from humiliation and pain. She thought of that terrible afternoon at the tea pavilion, of sitting alone while the whispers grew around her like thorns. She thought of the moment the Duke had entered, offering her salvation in the form of a marriage proposal from a stranger. She thought of how terrified she had been, how uncertain of the future. And now look at her. She was the Duchess of Ravenswood, mistress of one of the grandest estates in England. She was the mother, in every way that mattered, of a wonderful boy, and soon she would give birth to a child of her own body. She was the wife of a man she loved deeply, and who loved her in return with a fierce devotion that still sometimes took her breath away. The sound of carriage wheels on the drive drew her attention. A visitor, unexpected and unannounced. Eloise rose, curiosity overcoming her reluctance to leave her observation post, and made her way to the front of the house. The carriage that had arrived bore no crest, and the woman who descended from it was wrapped in a cloak that had seen better days. But when she pushed back her hood, Eloise recognized her immediately. Charlotte Ashworth. Charlotte looked vastly different from the last time Eloise had seen her. She was thinner, her face drawn and pale, and she carried an infant bundled in blankets. Behind her, a small maid descended from the carriage, looking cold and miserable. "Your Grace," Charlotte said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know I have no right to come here. I know you owe me nothing, but I had nowhere else to turn." Eloise felt a complex swirl of emotions, pity, wariness, and a lingering resentment that she was not proud of but could not entirely suppress. "You had better come inside," she said finally. "It is too cold to conduct this conversation on the drive." She led Charlotte to a small sitting room and ordered tea and refreshments. The maid was sent to the kitchen to warm herself, and the baby, a girl, Charlotte said, named Margaret, was settled in a basket near the fire. "Tell me," Eloise said once they were settled, "what has happened?" The story that emerged was one of steady decline. Percival's business ventures had failed. His uncle had indeed disowned him, cutting off his allowance. They had been forced to leave London, to take lodgings in an unfashionable part of Bath. Percival had grown bitter and resentful, drinking heavily and blaming Charlotte for their misfortunes. Finally, 3 months ago, he had simply left, departed one morning without a word and had not returned. "I have tried everything," Charlotte said, tears streaming down her face. "I have written to my family, but my father will not forgive me for the scandal. I have applied for positions, but no one will hire a woman with an infant and no references. I am at the end of my resources, Your Grace. I came here because I remembered that you were kind once, before I ruined everything." Eloise looked at the woman before her, the woman who had stolen her fiancé, who had humiliated her, who had shown her nothing but contempt. And she looked at the infant sleeping peacefully in the basket, innocent of her parents' sins. "Why should I help you?" Eloise asked quietly. "You have given me no reason to show you mercy." "I have not," Charlotte agreed, her voice breaking. "I have been cruel and selfish and foolish. I destroyed your happiness for my own gratification, and I have paid for it 1,000 times over. But my daughter, she has done nothing wrong. She deserves a chance at life, even if I do not." It was the mention of the child that decided the matter. Eloise thought of the baby growing inside her own body, of the love she already felt for this unborn child. She thought of Thomas and how he had needed a mother's care. She thought of the values that Alexander had taught her, that power and privilege carried with them the responsibility to show mercy, to lift up those who had fallen. "I will help you," Eloise said, and saw Charlotte's face transform with desperate hope. "But not in the way you might expect. I will not give you money to squander, nor will I use my influence to restore your position in society. What I will do is this: I will arrange for you to have a cottage on the Ravenswood estate, one of the properties we maintain for estate workers. You will have a small income, enough to live modestly but comfortably. In return, you will work. There is a school in the village that needs a teacher for the younger children. You read and write well, and you have the education necessary for the position." Charlotte stared at her in disbelief. "You would do that, after everything?" "I do it not for you, but for your daughter," Eloise said firmly. "And I do it because I have learned that holding on to anger and resentment only poisons one's own heart. You made terrible choices, Charlotte, and you have suffered for them. But suffering enough. It is time for you to rebuild your life, to become the mother your daughter deserves. Can you do that?" "Yes," Charlotte whispered. "Oh yes, Your Grace, I swear I will. I will work hard, I will be grateful, You will be honest," Eloise interrupted. "You will be kind. You will teach the village children with patience and care. And you will raise your daughter to be a woman of character and integrity. That is all I ask." When Alexander and Thomas returned from their skating expedition, rosy-cheeked and laughing, they found Eloise in the drawing room, staring into the fire with a thoughtful expression. "What has happened?" Alexander asked immediately, reading her mood with the intuition born of deep intimacy. Eloise told him about Charlotte's visit and the arrangement she had made. She watched his face carefully, uncertain of his reaction. "You have a generous heart," he said finally. "More generous than I possess, I think. But I trust your judgment, Eloise. If you believe this is the right course, then I support you. You are not angry?" "Angry? No. Impressed, rather. You have taken a situation that could have been vindictive and transformed it into an opportunity for redemption. That takes strength and wisdom." Thomas, who had been listening with wide eyes, spoke up. "Is the lady who was mean to you going to live on our estate, Mama?" "She is, darling. She has a baby daughter who needs a home." "Then I am glad," Thomas said with his characteristic seriousness. "Because babies should have homes, and mothers should have help. That is what you always say." Eloise felt tears prick her eyes. "That is exactly what I say. You are a very wise young man, Thomas Blackwood." In the months that followed, Eloise watched from a distance as Charlotte settled into her new life. The woman threw herself into her teaching duties with a dedication that surprised everyone, and the village children flourished under her care. She was seen regularly at church, sitting in the back pew with little Margaret, her head bowed in what seemed like genuine prayer. She made no attempt to impose on Eloise's generosity or to seek further favors. She simply worked and cared for her daughter and slowly began to rebuild a life from the ruins of her old one. Eloise's own life continued to blossom. In the spring, she gave birth to a daughter, a beautiful, healthy girl with Alexander's dark hair and her own grey-green eyes. They named her Catherine, after Alexander's mother, and the entire estate celebrated her arrival. 2 children, Alexander marveled, holding his infant daughter with the careful reverence of a man who had never expected to experience such joy again. 2 perfect, wonderful children, and a wife who is the center of my world. How did I become so fortunate? We both became fortunate, Eloise corrected, leaning against his shoulder and watching Thomas coo over his baby sister. We took a disaster and transformed it into something beautiful. As summer arrived and Ravenswood Hall was filled with the laughter of children, the warmth of family, and the deep contentment of love freely given and received, Eloise often thought back to that rainy afternoon at the tea pavilion. She thought of the girl she had been, dutiful, constrained, living a life designed by others, and she thought of the woman she had become, strong, purposeful, living a life she had chosen for herself. One afternoon, as she sat in the garden with Catherine sleeping in her arms and Thomas reading aloud from a book of natural history, Alexander came to join them. He settled beside her on the bench, his arm around her shoulders, and for a long moment they simply sat in peaceful silence. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "The way our marriage began? The circumstances that brought us together?" Eloise considered the question carefully. "I regret the pain," she said finally. "I regret the humiliation of that day, but I do not regret where it led me. I do not regret this life, this family, this love. Sometimes I think that we must be broken before we can be remade into who we were always meant to be." "Then we were both broken," Alexander said, pressing a kiss to her hair. "And we remade each other." "Yes," Eloise agreed, her eyes drifting closed in contentment. "We did." In the village, Charlotte Ashworth stood before her class of children, teaching them their letters with patience and care. In the evening she would return to her cottage, tend to her daughter, and write in the journal she had begun keeping, a record of her journey from pride to humility, from selfishness to service. She would never be welcomed back into the society she had once craved, would never regain the position she had thrown away. But she had something more valuable: honest work, a roof over her head, and the opportunity to raise her daughter in safety and peace. And she had it all because a woman she had wronged had chosen mercy over vengeance. In London, in a shabby set of rooms in an unfashionable quarter, Percival Ashworth sat alone with a bottle of cheap whiskey and a newspaper announcing the birth of the Duke and Duchess of Ravenswood's daughter. He stared at the notice until the words blurred, thinking of all he had lost, all he had thrown away in a moment of passion and poor judgment. He had gambled on love and lost everything. And unlike his wife, he had been offered no second chance, no opportunity for redemption. He had made his choices, and now he would live with them, alone and forgotten. But at Ravenswood Hall, where the roses bloomed and the children played, and love had taken root in soil once barren with grief, none of this mattered. The past was past, its lessons learned, and its wounds healed. The future stretched ahead, bright with promise, and Eloise Blackwood, Duchess of Ravenswood, faced it with courage, with grace, and with the unshakable knowledge that she had found exactly where she was meant to be. She had been abandoned at a tea pavilion, silent and humiliated. But the Duke and his young heir had altered her destiny, and in doing so had given her the greatest gift of all, the freedom to bloom where she was planted and to discover that sometimes the most beautiful gardens grow from the most unlikely seeds. If you enjoyed this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments which part of the world you're listening from. Share your thoughts about Eloise's journey, and how she transformed adversity into triumph. Your support helps these stories reach listeners everywhere.